All right, guys, so here we go with section 2. We're going to be talking about nationalism in Africa and the Middle East. This section is a little bit longer than the other ones, and there's a number of important topics to talk about with this one, including a number of things that is very likely you're going to see in the regions. So I'm actually going to break this section up into 2 videos, make them a little bit shorter. This one we're going to be focusing just on nationalism in Africa. So remember how we discussed in section 4 of chapter 26 how World War I, the principle of self-determination was only applied to creating new nations in Eastern Europe. Independence was not granted to the non-white regions of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that these regions would quietly accept this situation, though. Nationalist and independence movements spread throughout Africa and the Middle East to resist control by European powers. All right, but let's first look at colonial rule in Africa. Now, you should remember from chapter 25 that in the 1800s, European nations had conquered almost the entire continent of Africa. By the year 1900, there were only 2 countries in Africa that had remained independent. And in a lot of these colonies, there was widespread inequality between African and Europeans. Europeans owned the best land. They were the only ones who could grow certain crops. There were restrictions on when and how Africans could travel in their own lands. I mean, this picture illustrates it pretty well about who was the elite in these countries. So they were bumped down into very, very second-class status within their own countries, within the lands that their ancestors has lived on. Plus, there were significant job restrictions on Africans. Even Africans who were educated in the West could not achieve most good-paying job, but Western education was forced upon them in many ways. It was a thought, again, with the whole, social Darwinism and white man's burden. We're better than you, so you should be like us. So learn English, learn French, that type of stuff. But it really didn't help them in the long run, and that became very frustrated. The elites in Africa, they would try and educate their kids in a Western style, but then the jobs would still be denied to them. The status of the upper class would still be denied to them. So they couldn't achieve the good-paying jobs. Now, all of these conditions led to an increase in African resistance in the early 1900s. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the different specific examples in later chapters, because independence movements in Africa don't really gain momentum until after World War II in the 1950s and 60s. But one country where there was a very kind of unique situation in terms of the racial dynamics and where independence movements started a little earlier was in South Africa. Now, we're going to be talking more about South Africa in a later chapter, but it's important to know that South Africa was ruled by a white minority, which was different from the colonial administration that you saw in a lot of these countries. In South Africa, the government was designed so that the minority could stay in control. And the minority there was white, obviously, of European descent. Throughout the early 1900s, they did this by setting up a very strict racial segregation system, and that is known as apartheid. Apartheid was the official law of South Africa, and it was similar to the Jim Crow laws in the southern states during the 1950s and 60s, except it was applied to the entire country. Now, we're going to talk more about apartheid in chapter 32, but I just want to show you a couple of images to demonstrate what it was about. Here you see the sign, both in English and in the Afrikaans language of the Afrikaner people, kind of like more of a Dutch language, for use by white persons. Public premises have been reserved for the exclusive use of white persons. Again, very similar to what you'd see in like Alabama and Mississippi in the 1950s. Here you see that in the townships in South Africa, that's where the African populations lived. They were essentially under a police state, that military and police officers, notice they're all white, they could go into homes and they could arrest people whenever they wanted. You had to walk around with identification papers at all times if you were black in South Africa. Okay, so you were not free in your own country. Again, showing the racial segregation even in the beaches. All right, it's only for whites. Where the blacks were segregated to, as I said, the townships, they essentially became kind of communities of these ramshackle sheds and things of that nature. You didn't have anything in the way of real civilized amenities. You didn't have running water. You didn't have electricity. They would have to go, and travel into the white areas to work and so forth. But again, always had to have their identification papers. So it created a really, really horrible system of inequality. And it was only a matter of time before Africans were going to start seeking justice for this. Now, you did see a strong African nationalist movement emerge at this time called the African National Congress to protest the laws. Now, their efforts during the 1920s and 30s and so forth really didn't have much of an impact on South Africa's white government, but it did lay a foundation for later changes. Now, South Africa was the most glaring example of racial inequality that came from European colonialism, but it was far from the only one. Due to widespread injustices of colonialism, a widespread movement called PanAfricanism started in the 1920s. Now, we're going to be talking about Pan-Arabism later as well. When you see this prefix here, pan, that means across, as in across all of Africa, right? It was a movement that emphasized the unity of Africans and people of African descent, not even just on the continent of Africa, but all over the world. People in the Western Hemisphere, especially the Caribbean, and there were a number of leaders from the United States who got involved with this. The motto, Africa for Africans, it clearly directed at getting Europeans out of power in Africa. And in 1919, the Pan-African Congress was formed. It met in Paris while the peace conference after World War I was being held. And representatives from African colonies, the United States, and Caribbean islands, they came and they called on self-determination for Africa. Now, as we talked about several times, their demands were largely ignored. But we will talk more about some of the specific African independence movements that took place after World War II in later chapters. All right, so again, I kind of wanted to break this down into shorter sections. So that's it on Africa. And in the next one, we're going to be talking about nationalist and independence movements in the Middle East.